What experience do you really bring to this chamber? The words dropped from Mitt Romney's lips like a gauntlet thrown across the floor. Wow. Sharp enough to slice through the murmur of voices and send a chill running through the room. His tone wasn't curiosity. It was dismissal wrapped in the polished cadence of an old political hand. A man who believed time and pedigree were weapons that no newcomer could possibly match. The air tightened instantly. Eyes shifted. Phones lifted. Every camera in the chamber seemed to lean forward at once, capturing the single moment that had already begun to feel historic. For an instant, even the chatter of staffers in the back faded into silence. What Romney had said was more than a question, it was a judgment. A branding iron meant to scorch a rising voice before it could grow too loud. And sitting across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her stillness was its own defiance. She didn't scramble for papers or rush to fill the silence. She let it breathe, let the arrogance of his challenge hang in the air long enough for everyone in the chamber to taste it. The silence, in fact, spoke louder than any immediate reply could have. It told the story of countless moments where women, immigrants, and the underrepresented had been asked to prove they belonged in rooms built to exclude them. Romney's expression didn't shift. He leaned back as if the exchange were already won, as if this young, unseasoned congresswoman would shrink beneath his resume and his years. But in that pause, those eternal, suffocating seconds, the balance of power was already shifting. Because silence wasn't weakness, it was anticipation. The narration of history itself seemed to press down on the moment. The room went silent. Cameras zoomed in, and what came next would ripple far beyond the walls of Congress. Every viewer at home watching the clip would later describe the same sensation, a tightening in the chest, an instinctive recognition that something bigger than politics was about to happen. Crockett wasn't just about to answer a man. She was about to answer a history of being underestimated, and when she finally opened her mouth, no one expected her to respond the way she did. Why did the room freeze when Romney spoke? Because this wasn't just one senator's jab at a freshman, congresswoman. It was the weight of an entire system pressing down on a single individual. Mitt Romney wasn't simply Mitt Romney. He was the embodiment of a political order that believed longevity itself conferred legitimacy. His years as governor, his run for president, his long tenure in the Senate, all of it stood behind that question like a fortress of stone. And Jasmine Crockett. She was the new arrival, the outsider still learning the rhythms of the chamber, daring to walk in without the pedigree or generational privilege that others wore like armor. That imbalance mattered. It wasn't a fair fight, and everyone knew. To Romney, the question might have seemed routine, a mild jab that would pass without consequence. But to millions watching, it echoed something more sinister, the gatekeeping of power. The unspoken rule that experience is only valid when it comes in the right packaging, wealthy, male, polished, and approved by the establishment. Crockett represented everything outside that mold, a woman of color, a lawyer forged in courtrooms that didn't carry marble ceilings, a fighter who understood the struggles of ordinary families because she had lived them. Romney's challenge wasn't neutral. It carried the undertones of age versus youth, privilege versus grit, insider versus outsider. And beneath it all, familiar chord. The condescension women face when they enter spaces where they are expected to listen, not lead. That one question held centuries of history. How many times had voices like Crockett's been muted before? They could be heard. For viewers at home, the confrontation became symbolic in real time. They weren't simply seeing Romney and Crockett. They were seeing bosses who belittled employees, professors who questioned students' intelligence, politicians who dismissed communities as irrelevant. Crockett, in that moment, became a stand-in for millions who had been told they weren't qualified, weren't ready, didn't belong. And this is why the silence after Romney's words felt so thick. It wasn't just anticipation of Crockett's reply. It was recognition of the invisible lines drawn around who is allowed to wield power. Recognition of the arrogance that assumes only one kind of resume counts. While discounting lived experience, resilience, and service, Romney leaned on his decades. But Crockett carried something just as heavy, the urgency of a generation demanding to be heard, She brought with her the voices of immigrants whose stories were dismissed, of working mothers who never saw themselves in marble halls, of activists who were told change had to wait. That was her arsenal, and though it wasn't written in years of political office, it was far more explosive. To downplay her was to downplay all of them, and the audience knew it. This wasn't a question about Crockett alone. It was about who gets to lead America in the decades ahead. Is leadership the possession of the seasoned few who guard it like treasure? Or can it be claimed by those who rise from struggle, who speak with authenticity, who know firsthand what communities are fighting for? The tension grew because the answer wasn't clear yet. Romney had thrown the gauntlet. Crockett hadn't spoken. Everyone watching could feel that the narrative of power was about to bend. And if history has taught us anything, it's that moments like these, sharp exchanges can tip the balance of perception for years to come. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending the right of every underestimated voice to claim space, and Crockett wasn't about to stay silent. Asterisk to understand why Romney's question cut so sharply, you have to understand the man behind it. Mitt Romney was not just another senator tossing out a line in debate. He carried into that chamber the aura of someone who had lived his entire life within the highest echelons of privilege and power. From birth, his path was paved with advantages few Americans could ever imagine. The son of a governor raised in the safety of wealth, educated at elite institutions, he entered politics with a resume already gilded in gold. His career read like the script of an American dynasty: governor of Massachusetts, Republican nominee for president, two-term U.S. senator. Decades in the public eye had made him synonymous with establishment respectability. Romney's name alone evoked the old guard, seasoned, polished, practiced in the theater of politics. He wasn't a bomb thrower like some of his contemporaries. He cultivated the image of a statesman, someone who spoke in measured tones, who often seemed to rise above the chaos of his party, who was branded as the moderate, the reasonable, conservative, the one who could shake his head at extremism while still guarding the gate of power. That image gave him credibility in the eyes of the media, a reputation as the adult in the room. But beneath that polished exterior was something less admirable, a streak of condescension, sharpened by years of being told he belonged in every room he entered. That condescension is what surfaced when he looked at Jasmine Crockett and questioned her experience. But Romney's experience wasn't measured in lived struggle or in battles fought on behalf of ordinary people. Experience, in his world, was a list of titles and positions, a pedigree of power that could be traced back generations. To him, Crockett's resume couldn't possibly measure up because it didn't mirror his. And so he dismissed her in the way that establishment figures have dismissed outsiders for centuries, by questioning whether she was even qualified to stand at the table. Romney's contradictions made the moment even sharper. Here was the man who publicly broke with his party to condemn Donald Trump, who had been praised for moments of moral clarity. Yet here, faced with a woman who represented the very diversity and renewal America's democracy thrives on, he reached not for dignity, but for dismissal. The moderate mask slipped, revealing a man deeply invested in the old hierarchies of power. The assumption was clear. Gravitas belonged to him, not to her. Authority was his, by virtue of lineage and longevity. She was, in his eyes, still waiting her turn. And yet, for all his pedigree, Romney's career was also defined by near misses and contradictions. He had once come within reach of the presidency, but lost. He was respected in the Senate, yet often isolated from both wings of his party. He was a man who seemed forever to be holding power but never fully grasping it. That insecurity, tucked behind his practiced smile, gave weight to his dismissal of Crockett. It was the reflex of someone who had been told his whole life that he was born to lead, now confronted with a new generation that questioned whether leadership had to look like him. Romney's brand of establishment arrogance wasn't loud or brash. It was quieter, subtler, but no less sharp. It came in the form of a question that seemed polite on its surface, but was designed to wound, to remind Crockett of her place. His words echoed the long tradition of gatekeepers protecting the marble halls, ensuring that those who enter understand they are temporary guests, not permanent equals. This was the villainy of Romney in that moment. Not that he shouted, not that he insulted with crude language, but that he cloaked his condescension in civility. It was the genteel arrogance of a man convinced that the world bends to experience defined only by people like him. And in that, he became the perfect foil. For what better drama than the clash between polished entitlement and raw, unshakable authenticity? The cameras captured it all, the cool tilt of his head, the half-smile of someone who believed the exchange was already won. He had, after all, spent a lifetime winning these kinds of battles, or so he thought, because what Romney could not anticipate was that his long resume, his pedigree, his carefully constructed aura of establishment power would soon collapse under the weight of a single answer. But his long resume would soon look small in the face of one response. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in Congress, she had already lived the kind of battles that forged her into the figure who could stare down Mitt Romney without flinching. Hers was not a life cushioned by dynasty or inherited power. She was born into working-class realities where every step forward had to be earned, not granted. Raised in an America that often told young black women to stay quiet, to stay small, Crockett instead sharpened her voice into a tool of defiance and justice. Her path began not in marble corridors, but in classrooms where expectations were low, where whispers about limits and realistic goals followed students who looked like her. But Crockett was stubborn. She studied harder, fought harder, carved out space for herself where the doors seemed locked. Education wasn't just a ladder for her, it was a lifeline, one she gripped with both hands, determined never to let go. When she chose law, it wasn't out of ambition for prestige, but out of necessity. She saw the way communities like hers were treated in the justice system, how the poor and marginalized were swallowed by courts that barely gave them a voice. She became a public defender, walking into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients and demanding fairness, where fairness rarely lived. These were not glamorous cases. They didn't make headlines or pad resumes. They were the hard, grinding work of defending dignity against a system built to strip it away. Crockett carried those cases with her. Every man wrongly accused, every family torn apart by laws written without compassion, she remembered them. Those faces were the reason she kept showing up. It's the reason she kept fighting even when the hours were long and the victory scarce. And in those courtrooms, she developed the skills that would one day stun Romney, the ability to stay composed under pressure, to speak with clarity when her opponent tried to rattle her, to expose hypocrisy with nothing more than truth delivered plainly. But the courtroom was only the beginning. The pull of politics came later, almost reluctantly. Crockett had no illusions about how difficult it would be for someone like her to break into that world, especially in Texas, a state where power was tightly held and diversity in leadership was still treated as novelty rather than necessity. She ran for office not because it was easy, but because it was urgent. Communities were crying out for representation, for someone who understood their struggles, not as statistics, but as lived experience. Her campaigns were uphill battles underdog, fights where money was scarce and opposition was fierce. She knocked on doors until her knuckles ached. She spoke in living rooms, community centers, in small town halls where people looked at her with skepticism until they heard her speak and recognized something familiar: authenticity. She wasn't selling them polished talking points. She was telling them her story, and in her story, they saw their own. Being a black woman in Texas politics meant carrying extra burdens. Her ideas weren't just debated, they were dismissed. Her presence wasn't just questioned, it was attacked. She faced the double bind of sexism and racism, the whispered doubts about her competence, the open sneers about whether she belonged in the halls of power at all. But every insult, every closed door, every attempt to minimize her only steeled her resolve. Crockett learned how to turn doubt into fuel. She learned how to walk into rooms designed to make her feel small and instead fill them with her voice. And beneath the struggles was always her driving force: service. Crockett didn't run for power's sake. She ran for the people who raised her, for the neighborhoods too often ignored, for the families who couldn't afford to hire lobbyists to fight for their interests. Every decision she made, Every battle she picked was tied to that foundation. She wasn't trying to be another politician in the marble halls. She was trying to be the voice those halls had long denied. This is what Romney could never understand when he dismissed her. He saw her resume. She carried a legacy. He measured experience in years and titles. She measured it in lives touched, in barriers broken, in fights fought without applause. That is what made her uniquely prepared to face his question. Because she had faced versions of it her entire life, sometimes from professors, sometimes from colleagues, sometimes from voters, and often from the very systems meant to hold everyone equal under law. Every "you're not ready" she had heard, every "you don't belong here" she had endured, was training for this. Every insult, every doubt, every struggle had prepared her for the moment when the weight of the establishment would try to silence her once more. So when Romney leaned back in his chair, confident that his long resume and polished arrogance had already won the exchange, he wasn't seeing the full story. He wasn't seeing the years of courtrooms, campaigns fought with grit instead of cash, the sacrifices made for communities that had no one else to fight for them. He wasn't seeing the scars that made her strong, the resilience that made her unshakable. Every hardship she endured led to this exact moment. The silence after Romney's first jab still lingered when he leaned forward again, his voice cutting across the chamber with that same calm dismissal. "Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, Congresswoman," he said, each syllable dripping with paternal authority. "This is serious work. Takes years, decades to truly understand the weight of governing. You can't just walk in here with passion and expect to shape policy. Experience matters." The words were polite enough on the surface, but the undertone was unmistakable. It wasn't explanation, it was erasure. He was painting her as an amateur, someone whose place was temporary, someone not yet worthy of being heard. A few senators shifted in their seats, some nodding faintly, others uneasy with the imbalance. Staffers scribbled notes furiously, sensing that something more than a routine exchange was taking place. Crockett didn't flinch. She sat still, shoulders squared, her gaze steady on Romney. The only movement was the faint tilt of her head, the kind of gesture that signaled she had heard everything, measured it, and found it wanting. She didn't rush to interrupt, didn't let anger dictate her posture. Instead, she embodied composure. Itself, her restraint, a counterpunch more devastating than raised voices could ever be. Romney pressed on as if her silence was an admission of weakness. "You see, governing is not about slogans or fiery speeches. It's about history, about experience, about knowing how the system works. That's why people like me who have been through these storms carry the burden of leadership. You may have good intentions, but intentions alone don't make you ready." The imbalance was palpable. Seasoned statesman speaking down to a younger congresswoman, cloaking condescension and civility. The chamber felt tense, as though the walls themselves recognized the imbalance. Camera zoomed closer, searching Crockett's expression for cracks. None appeared. Her composure became its own performance, her silence puncturing Romney's monologue more effectively than interruption ever could. It was as though she was letting him build the pedestal higher and higher, knowing that when it collapsed, the fall would be spectacular. Whispers rippled through the room. Journalists scribbled notes, some exchanging quick glances that said without words, "She's about to respond." Even senators who had initially tuned out leaned forward, now sensing the coming storm. Suspense built with each second she withheld her reply. Each moment she let Romney's condescension grow heavier, more arrogant. Romney's body language shifted. His voice remained smooth, but his eyes betrayed the confidence of a man convinced. He had already won the exchange. He sat back slightly, one hand resting on the table, the other gesturing with the calm arrogance of a professor certain that his student had nothing more to offer.
Wow.
To him, the silence was victory. To everyone else, it was tension wound so tightly that the room could barely breathe. Crockett finally moved, adjusting the microphone in front of her with deliberate slowness. The simple act drew every eye. She cleared her throat softly, not in nervousness, but in preparation, the way an athlete might inhale before the decisive play. The room seemed to tilt toward her, drawn by the gravity of what was about to be said. She looked at Romney not with anger, but with a steady calm that carried more weight than fury ever could. Her posture was relaxed, yet unyielding, her presence commanding without theatrics. And in that moment, the imbalance shifted. It was no longer a senior statesman lecturing a freshman congresswoman. It was two forces facing each other, one armed with decades of entitlement, the other armed with truth and resilience. The air was electric. Spectators leaned forward, hands gripping pens, breaths caught in throats. It wasn't just another exchange. Now, it felt cinematic, like the build-up to a line that would be replayed, quoted, remembered, and then she dropped the line that no one saw coming. Her voice began low, deliberate, steady, each word wrapped in a calm that made the silence before it seem like prelude. "Senator Romney," Jasmine Crockett said, "I appreciate your concern about my readiness. But with all due respect, you're asking the wrong question." The room shifted immediately. Heads lifted, pens frozen mid-sentence. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, but she didn't need to. Her composure carried more force than volume ever could. It was the precision of her tone, the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for moments exactly like this. "You ask what experience I bring?" she continued, eyes locked on him, unwavering. "Let me start with the years. I spent in courtrooms defending people who couldn't afford a lawyer, people whose futures hung on whether someone like me stood beside them. I've argued for young men who were locked away before they had a chance to speak for themselves. I've fought for women who were ignored until they found someone willing to amplify their voices. That is not theory. That is experience. And it is the kind of experience this chamber needs more of." A murmur rippled across the room. Staffers glanced at one another. Reporters scribbled frantically. Crockett leaned forward, her hands folded, calmly on the desk, as if to anchor her words in steadiness. "You measure experience in years served," she said, "but I measure it in lives touched. You count titles. I count the people who tell me their child is alive today because we stood up to a broken system." You point to decades in office. I point to decades in communities that this government too often forgets. Romney shifted in his seat. His confident half-smile faltered, just slightly, but enough for cameras to capture. Crockett didn't pause to savor it. She pressed forward, her rhythm building. "When you've sat with families in Texas who had to choose between paying for insulin and paying rent, you understand policy differently. When you've walked into courtrooms where a person's skin color determined how they were treated, you understand justice differently. That's the experience I bring. It's not the kind written on plaques or stitched into resumes. The kind earned in the trenches of real life, fighting for those this chamber is supposed to serve." The murmurs grew louder, almost like the crowd at a theater sensing the turn of the story. Romney's posture tightened. He crossed his arms, then uncrossed them. His jaw flexed. For the first time, his carefully polished mask was cracking. Crockett let the pause hang, then continued slower now, every syllable measured. "Senator, you've had the privilege of decades. But let me remind you, longevity does not equal leadership. Tenure does not guarantee wisdom, and pedigree is no substitute for empathy." Gasps echoed softly around the chamber. Crockett's tone hadn't wavered from calm dignity, but the sharpness of her words cut deeper than any shouted insult. She leaned back slightly, scanning the room, making eye contact with those watching. "The truth is, the very question you asked me, what experience do I bring, proves why I belong here. Because if you can look at someone who has fought in courts, served in communities, and sacrificed for people outside these walls, and still reduce her to inexperienced, then it shows exactly what needs to change in this chamber." The weight of her words settled like stone. A staffer in the back muttered, "Wow." Another stifled a grin. The air itself felt different now, thick with the sense that something irreversible had just occurred. Romney blinked, his lips parted, as if searching for a response, but none came. Crockett seized the silence, letting it underline her point. "I didn't come here to be measured against someone else's yardstick. I came here because the people who sent me demanded that their voices finally be heard. That is my qualification. That is my authority. Frankly, Senator, that is my experience. Applause wasn't allowed on the floor, but energy vibrated through the chamber all the same. A senator on the far side raised her eyebrows, clearly impressed. Journalists' fingers flew across keyboards, knowing they were capturing history in real time. Crockett lowered her voice just slightly, giving her words a gravity that demanded attention. You want to know what makes me ready? Every barrier I've had to break just to sit in this chair? Every dismissal, every insult, every time someone told me to wait my turn. Those weren't obstacles, they were training, as they are the reason I will not be silent when people try to keep leadership reserved for the privileged few. Romney shifted again, his eyes darting toward the cameras, his face tightening. His silence was deafening now. The silence of a man unaccustomed to being dismantled so completely, so publicly. Without a single raised voice, Crockett finished with a calm that carried more power than thunder. So yes, Senator, I do bring experience. And if my presence here unsettles the old order, maybe that's not a weakness. Maybe that's the point. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the clicking of cameras capturing Romney's stillness. His jaw clenched, his gaze lowered, his voice absent. It's a silence not of authority, but of defeat. Crockett sat back, composed, almost serene. She hadn't shouted, hadn't flailed. She had simply told the truth, and in doing so, stripped Romney of the very pedestal he'd been standing on. The chamber exhaled. It's like a theater audience realizing they'd just witnessed the climax of the drama. Romney remained speechless, his long resume suddenly paper-thin against the weight of her lived truth. But the real explosion came outside that chamber. The chamber itself may have fallen into silence, but outside those marble walls, the world roared to life. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's response hit social media. At first, they spread like sparks one tweet, then two, then a flood. But soon the sparks became a firestorm. At the end of the hour, her words had ignited the internet in a way few congressional moments ever do. The hashtags came first. Hashtag Experience Matters started sarcastically, attached to the video of Romney's stunned face. Then came hashtag Crockett Clapback, rising fast through trending lists across Twitter and TikTok. By nightfall, one stood above the rest. Hashtag Speechless, the single word that captured Romney's silence and Crockett's triumph. Memes multiplied with breathtaking speed. Side-by-side shots of Romney's frozen expression paired with captions like, "Ow. When you realize your resume can't save you," ricocheted across feeds. TikTok users layered Crockett's words over cinematic music, turning her reply into short, viral montages watched millions of times within hours. Instagram Reels dramatized the moment with slow-motion zooms, captions flashing across the screen. Tenure isn't wisdom. Pedigree isn't empathy. But this wasn't just internet. Humor it was validation. For countless viewers, especially women, immigrants, and people of color, Crockett's words felt like more than a takedown. They felt like a collective exhale, a moment of recognition that finally someone inside the halls of power had voiced. The frustration so many carried, praise poured in from across the political spectrum. Progressive activists hailed it as a generational turning point. Commentators on mainstream outlets called it one of the sharpest congressional exchanges in recent memory. Even some conservatives, wary of Romney's establishment image, admitted that Crockett had shown undeniable poise. Celebrities joined the chorus. Musicians tweeted lyrics inspired by her words. Actors reshared the video with simple captions like, "This right here." Athletes reposted memes of Romney's stunned silence, writing, "That's how you respond when they doubt you." Amplification gave the moment cultural weight far beyond politics. News anchors, sensing a viral wave they couldn't ignore, played the clip repeatedly on evening broadcasts. Panels debated its significance. Was this a clash of generations? A new model for political confrontation? Or simply the power of authenticity cutting through polished entitlement? Whatever the angle, one thing was certain: Crockett's reply had become more than a soundbite. It had become a story. The ripple effects were immediate. Grassroots groups reported spikes in donations after sharing the video. Community organizations played the clip at meetings as an example of why representation mattered. College students circulated it in group chats, with comments like, "This is why we need new voices in power." The moment wasn't confined to social media, it was spilling into real life, energizing conversations across the country. Romney, by contrast, became the unwilling face of a meme-ire defeat. Headlines framed him not as a seasoned statesman, but as the man left speechless. Editorials dissected his question, pointing out how it revealed the deeper arrogance of the establishment. Overnight, his decades of experience had been overshadowed by one viral silence. And yet, the real power of the moment wasn't in the memes or hashtags. It was in the way people felt watching Crockett stand her ground. For many, it was the first time they had seen themselves reflected so clearly in a congressional confrontation, not as the target of dismissal, but as the voice that rose above it. It was more than entertainment. It was empowerment. A young activist in Los Angeles tweeted, "I've been told my whole life I don't have enough experience." Tonight, Crockett answered for all of us. A teacher in Houston shared the clip with her students, writing, "This is how you carry yourself with dignity when someone underestimates you." Thousands echoed the same sentiment, Crockett's. Words were not just hers. They belonged to everyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or diminished. It was, in many ways, a cultural turning point. Not because one congresswoman silenced one senator, but because the exchange symbolized the shift underway in America, the passing of the torch from pedigreed insiders to leaders forged in lived struggle. The internet had crowned its victor. The people had found their voice in hers. And the establishment had been reminded that gravitas can no longer be measured by years alone. Yet beyond the headlines, the deeper meaning was even more powerful. When the storm of applause, memes, and headlines began to settle, the core of Crockett's moment revealed itself. It wasn't just about Romney's silence or a viral clip. It was about the values that rang out in her response, the kind that echo far beyond politics. She had reframed a dismissive question into something universal, something every person who has ever been underestimated could hold on to at its heart. The lesson was simple. Dignity matters more than elitism. Romney's pedigree, the private schools, the boardrooms, the presidential campaigns, had given him status. But Crockett's dignity, earned through years of fighting for people who had little, carried more weight in that chamber than all the glittering accolades in the world. Her poise in that moment proved that respect is not granted by resumes, it's commanded by character. Equally powerful was her reminder that service outweighs pedigree. Romney embodied the insider's path. Family wealth, legacy connections, decades spent circling the pinnacles of power. Crockett, by contrast, had climbed from the ground up. She had taken on cases others avoided, fought for clients who couldn't afford the fight, and built her career not on privilege, but on persistence. Her response wasn't just a defense of her experience, it was a declaration that service to community, however humble, is a higher qualification than any gilded resume. And, above all, the exchange made clear that courage triumphs over arrogance. Romney's challenge was meant to diminish, to remind a newcomer of her place, but Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't lash out in anger or retreat in silence. She stood firm, measured, and unyielding. Quiet courage turned as arrogance. Back on itself, exposing how fragile entitlement becomes when confronted by integrity. For millions watching, the moral crescendo was undeniable. This wasn't just about Crockett versus Romney. It was about what kind of America people wanted to believe in. An America where the son of a governor and the product of elite institutions assumes authority simply because of heritage, or an America where a black woman from working-class roots could step into power, not through entitlement, but through grit, service, and courage. The answer seemed to echo in every cheer, every meme, every shared clip. America's story is evolving, and Crockett's moment was proof. Her words turned into a mirror for the nation. For immigrants told they don't belong, for young people told they lack experience, for women told they should wait their turn, her response wasn't just defiance, it was vindication. She showed that the future doesn't wait for permission. From the past, it demands its place, with dignity, service, and courage leading the way. And in that, Crockett wasn't just answering Romney. She was answering every voice of doubt that has ever tried to hold back progress. She was showing that arrogance is finite, but courage is contagious. Her composure, her clarity, her calm rebuttal, all of it, lit a path forward for those who felt unseen. The moment grew larger than one exchange because it became aspirational. It whispered a truth that people longed to hear, that leadership isn't defined by what you inherit, but by what you stand for. That pedigree can open doors, but service can move mountains. That arrogance fades, but dignity endures. As the echoes of her words settled into history, they left behind a challenge to everyone listening. If one congresswoman could face down decades of establishment weight with a single answer, what could millions of voices do together? And if one response could silence a titan, imagine what voices like yours can do. In the end, the headline said, "It all Mitt Romney questions Jasmine Crockett's experience. Her response leaves him speechless." But behind that headline was something deeper. It wasn't just about one question, one chamber, or one silence. It was about the timeless clash between power and principle, between entitlement and service, between arrogance and courage. Crockett's answer wasn't rehearsed, and it wasn't delivered from a place of privilege. It came from lived experience, from sacrifice, from years spent carrying the weight of others' struggles. And when she spoke, it cut through every layer of doubt and pretense. For a moment, the chamber was still, but outside, a movement stirred. That's the power of truth. Spoken plainly, of courage wielded with dignity. It reminds us that even in halls built to intimidate, steady voice can shift the ground beneath giants. And here's where you come in. Because this moment isn't just history, it's a spark. If moments like this inspire you, if you believe in courage over arrogance, in service over pedigree, then don't just watch, be part of the story. Hit subscribe so you never miss the voices that refuse to be silenced. Share this with someone who needs to remember that dignity still triumphs, that truth still resonates, that courage still matters. We live in a time when power often tries to drown out principle. But Crockett's moment proved something undeniable. When courage rises, arrogance falls silent. And that lesson isn't just hers, it belongs to all of us. So let this be more than a video. Let it be a reminder that together with voices united, we can still make giants speechless.